The deer is the symbol of the Scottish Highlands, a magnificent wild creature renowned the world over as the monarch of the Glen. But as Scottish Eye reveals tonight, red deer are now destroying the last priceless remnants of ancient Caledonian forest and threatening the very future of the fragile Highland environment on which they depend. The red deer is central to Scotland's natural heritage. Today there are over 300,000, free to roam over vast areas of the Highlands. Originally a woodland animal, as the native forests have been felled over the last 300 years, it's been forced to adapt to survival on the open hills.
I think the important thing about the red deer is our greatest natural asset. This biggest land mammal that we have, and as a sporting value and as venison production, it is one of the best natural resources that we have in Scotland at the moment.
But in many parts of the Highlands there are far too many deer, and they're destroying its unique woodlands. That's what one of Britain's leading ecologists, Dr. Adam Watson, says is plainly evident here in the eastern Cairngorms at Mar Lodge.
Since the deer numbers went up in the late 1700s, there's been virtually no regeneration of young trees at all. It's a beautiful place, but it's a decaying place. What you ought to see is a variety of tree ages, with young ones, middle-aged ones, as well as these beautiful old ones. And we can't let it continue like this. Eventually these woods will become extinct.
Of the great Caledonian forest that once covered most of the Highlands, less than 1% now remains. This Scots pine is more than 500 years old.
It's a bit sad and ironic that underneath that great old tree we can see this dead deer calf, which has died sometime in a snowy night last winter, trying to get shelter here, but not enough, and in the end it died of starvation. The pressure of deer mouths and deer trampling and dunging on the ground is so great that you begin to get bare ground which isn't actually growing anything. Where that's on slopes, you get quicker runoff and soil erosion, and there are some places, the worst cases, where whole hillsides are showing signs of severe stress due to erosion.
West across the Cairngorms from Mar Lodge, in another remnant of ancient Caledonian forest at Glen, the erosion being caused by deer could be creating further problems.
The worst case I know of this is in the upper parts of Glen, where there is simply too much bare ground at a high angle hillside caused by too many deer, and you've got severe gulling and runoff, streams getting into flood, and there has actually been a lot of talk recently about the Feshie being in flood and the effects of this further down Speyside.
That there is erosion at Glen is indisputable. But in spite of the latticework of deer tracks, not everyone is prepared to blame the red deer, least of all the owner of the estate, Wiltshire businessman John Dibben.
There's no obvious evidence of the existing grazing dying back or being overgrazed, and so again I don't think that is true. Landslips or bare patches, I don't believe it. I mean, I just don't see evidence of it here. There have been landslips, I'm sure, which have caused for all sorts of reasons, but not a lot to do with the deer.
The number of red deer throughout Scotland has doubled over the last 30 years, from 150,000 in 1963 to 300,000 now. The threat posed by deer is not the same in every part of the Highlands, but much of the last 1% of Caledonian forest is at risk in the Cairngorms and in other areas, including the Royal Estate at Balmoral.
Certainly the population has doubled over the last 20 or 30 years, but there's a combination of reasons for that. Most of all, probably a series of mild winters. and perhaps a cull that should have been heavier again on the hinds.
The deer population has traditionally been controlled by culling the hinds, the female deer, for a restricted period in late autumn and winter. While the limited daylight and deteriorating weather don't make the hind cull any easier, there is another problem.
In many situations, it has been traditional numbers that have been killed. In other words, on one estate, we killed 30 hinds in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. So we will continue to kill that number. And it was only in the early 70s was it then recognised that under that method, under that regime, that the population was rising very fast. And it's continued to rise very fast since then.
Since the 19th century, large sporting estates have been a dominant feature of Highland land use, transforming vast areas of the Highlands into a playground where the rich could shoot red deer and grouse. Today, landowners still manage deer in much the same way as 150 years ago. At Glen, John Dibben enjoys stalking as much as his 19th century counterparts, but he complains that running his sporting estate costs him money.
We absolutely adore stalking, and we adore Scotland, and the Highlands particularly. We have about 2,000 deer on the estate. That's 1,000 hinds and 1,000 stags. The estate size is about 42,000 acres. I think if you're going to run an estate in a reasonably traditional way, which is what we try and do, it is extremely difficult to make money on it. I don't see how it ever could. So we are constantly putting money into the estate. The impression that we use it purely for our own pleasure and at the expense of everybody else, it is simply wrong. Culling hinds is a very, very good sport. It takes place a bit later in the winter. It's a bit colder, but they're very wary, and it makes the stalking more difficult on the whole. And it's extremely good fun. We need to keep our hinds down to numbers which are compatible with the stags and compatible with the estate's ability to sustain that number of deer. So our hind cull is roughly the same as the stag cull. It's at roughly 15%.
But conservationists say a cull of only 15% is totally inadequate.
And the deer are quite a fast reproducing animal, and you've got to kill something in the order of 20% a year just to stay level. If you let that drop to 15, 12%, then you've got a population explosion. And so that's what's been happening, that they haven't been killing enough hinds, and so the population has been going up.
Some landowners may be hesitant to kill hinds on the basis that the hinds are the mothers of stags. So therefore, they feel that by killing lots of hinds, then they will reduce the number of stags that's available for them to shoot. Now, I think this is something that needs correcting.
Although some deer managers are beginning to accept the need to cull more hinds, they reject any suggestion that deer numbers are being kept deliberately high. More than 20 estates in the West Highlands are managed by Richard Sidgwick.
I think it's completely wrong to suggest that landowners are increasing the numbers of stags on their properties purely and simply to improve the quality of sport. If one did that as a general practice, it would upset the age structure of one's herd. One may shoot more stags, but one certainly wouldn't shoot better stags.
The landowners who own these deer forests, they have been thinking purely in terms of the short-term gain. They haven't been thinking about what's going to happen next century. And this is a problem about land use in general.
The argument some of the environmentalists use is that actually we're not getting natural regeneration in the estate. And I think to an extent that's true. I don't think that the Caledonian forest or the old pine forest is going to regenerate at certainly at the speed that people would like, or some of these people would like, if you've got the number of the deer population we at present have got at Glen.
Not only do owners of sporting estates claim they cannot afford to reduce deer numbers, there's a further disincentive: the archaic system of land valuation in the Highlands.
The sporting value is assessed on the number of stags that you can kill on a particular estate. And it's the average over a period of 5 years that is normally taken to do this. And for each stag, the sporting value is £25,000, and it can be more. And clearly, the economics of this drives the situation on estates to more deer.
But today, fewer and fewer estates are being bought solely for their stalking and shooting.
This system may have had some value in the past, but now is becoming increasingly unrealistic because people are buying Highland estates for a far, far wider range of reasons to do with amenity and the quality of the environment rather than simply what you can shoot on it.
When the next harsh winter comes, the red deer's destruction of its environment may have a particularly tragic result for the deer themselves.
One consequence of the build-up of the population is that if we were now to have a very severe winter, like last occurred really back in the 60s, there could be very severe winter mortality of deer due to lack of shelter and lack of food. And this could result in 30, 40, 50,000 deer dying in a very short period.
In the end, if the deer numbers are allowed to increase and you get more and more bare ground, there will be a final solution from Mother Nature, and that's what it will be, which will be very cruel to the deer.
One of the few places in the Highlands where the deer problem is being tackled is at the National Nature Reserve at Craigmeggy.
Stalking deer in an area like this is very challenging because the animals are particularly well adapted to this type of terrain. They understand the weather and how the wind works in these corries. So the stalker really has to put his wits against the animal. From the moment you first spy an animal, the adrenaline starts flowing, and the animals can be disturbed up to a kilometre or more away if they pick up your scent. They have very keen eyesight and the first inkling of human presence, they're generally up and off. To actually get in close to an animal, one has to take into consideration the topography, the lie of the land, and use that to your maximum advantage, using every little knoll, bank, gully, terrace, whatever it may be, simply to get close enough to the animal to be able to shoot it. I don't derive pleasure from killing deer. Satisfaction knowing that you're doing a job and doing it well because you're trying to achieve a long-term objective, which is restoration of the native woodlands here.
Conservationists argue that only by killing many thousands of deer can the native woodlands thrive. By culling at Craigmeggy, the Nature Conservancy Council is beginning to save the native birchwoods.
In order to try and safeguard and regenerate this forest, we must reduce the grazing mouths that feed on young trees. And that's what we've been doing since 1985, gradually bringing the population down to the point that you see today where we are winning. Normally, on an estate, you would count the numbers of deer that inhabit that estate. Here, we count the number of seedlings, because that is the measure of success. More seedlings requires less deer. And it's as simple as that. So therefore, we have reduced the number of deer to allow those seedlings to grow. And we do not want a situation of no deer. We want deer because, after all, the red deer was one of the natural ingredients of the native forest.
So how would conservationists assess how many deer should be killed?
The sensible way to do it is to use the criteria not of the percentage of the deer or the density of deer, but of the state of the ground itself. The state of the trees, the state of the hill, the state of the shrubs, the state of the soil. That in the end is the ultimate resource, which we must not overuse.
Conservationists argue that in the long term, restoring native woodland will actually sustain more deer than can live on the windswept open ground. However, sporting estates refuse to cull to the point where natural regeneration will occur.
We do care about the land, we do care about the environment, we do care about regeneration, and we do our best. If somebody could show me that by killing a fairly minor amount, so that it wouldn't affect our stalking to a dramatic extent, I would be interested in talking about it. But the sort of numbers which I think they would need for us to actually kill here, they would make it unviable. It would be a hopeless situation.
Under mounting pressure to cull more deer, estate owners have come up with an alternative solution to protect native woodland.
If you want to regenerate an area, then the quick way to do it is simply to fence it and to maintain deer fencing over a period of 20 years or thereabouts. That will give you an established wood within that period of time.
There is no doubt that fencing deer out leads to rapid regeneration of young trees, but landowners say this would have to be publicly funded.
I think if we go on as we are at the moment with the number of deer we've got on the estate, then I think the regeneration of a Caledonian forest without any fencing would be very slow indeed, and possibly not at all. I just don't think you can buck that.
I think that fencing is not a solution to this problem in the long run, because it destroys the natural character of the forest, and it's extremely expensive to the taxpayer. In the end, everybody's going to benefit if the deer numbers are reduced.
In the large areas of upland where wild red deer have always roamed free, fencing is clearly impractical. Over the last 100 years, there have been no fewer than 7 government inquiries into red deer, all attempting to tackle the problem, but without success. Indeed, since 1957, there's been a body with special powers to cull deer to protect agriculture and commercial forestry, the Red Deer Commission.
For 30 years, the Red Deer Commission has said that there are too many wild red deer in Scotland, yet the population has continued to increase. Now, the Red Deer Commission might, with some justification, claim that it's been starved of resources and to pursue its objectives, but it has not even used the full powers available to it. It has relied on exhorting the landowners to kill more deer, and this has failed.
The reason why the Red Deer Commission has failed to stop this increase or get the deer numbers reduced is because I think a high proportion of the people on the Red Deer Commission have been private landowners with deer stalking estates.
I don't agree with that. I don't agree that the Red Deer Commission is deferential to landowners. This is just not the case. In fact, it took years to convince landowners that the Red Deer Commission's interests were the same as landowners, but mostly for the welfare of deer themselves.
Now the government has embarked upon a major review of deer policy. It's recently published a consultation paper, and responses have to be submitted by April. One of its most radical suggestions is that there should be new powers to force estates to cull deer where they're shown to be seriously damaging the natural environment. This would not go down well with landowners.
I think that landowners generally would be opposed to any move to give the Red Deer Commission authority to require them to reduce deer numbers on their estates.
I think it would be catastrophic. I personally feel it's totally wrong, because as I think I said originally, I believe the culture of a Highland estate is the thing that people should be trying to preserve, not some particular feature of that culture.
Already, landowners are grouping together to resist such interference in the control of their land.
I am generally wary of any proposal to give government agencies power to require landowners to do anything. I believe that very often the landowner and his advisors, which includes a broad spectrum of people, are the best fitted to make these sort of decisions.
Robin Callender, who co-authored a new report on red deer, thinks that even if it was introduced, compulsory culling might lead to massive compensation payments to estate owners. This could bankrupt the government's new nature conservation agency, Scottish Natural Heritage, which starts up in April.
All landowners, as a matter of course, should be required to maintain the status quo of the existing habitat, and that would include regenerating and perpetuating the existing area of native woodlands. And that should be a matter of not of compensation or substantial bribery, but a matter of sound land use.
Historically, there's another dimension which is often overlooked by those who assume that sporting estates have always been part of Highland culture. Angus McRae, whose own grandparents were evicted by Victorian landowners, represents crofters on the Red Deer Commission.
It would be impossible for me to accept that the sporting estate as we know it is part of the culture of the Highlands and Islands. It is alien, it is comparatively recent. To have culture, to have heritage, one must have community, one must have people. Deer forests, sporting estates were established by getting rid of people, and to claim now that they have done anything for culture and heritage is misrepresenting the facts.
Today, the key question is, for whose benefit should the land be managed? Should private sporting interests be allowed to determine the fate of our greatest natural assets?
I think there is a culture to a Highland estate which is not just regenerating Caledonian pines. It's the stalking of the deer, it's the grouse, it's the fishing, it's the people, it's the bothies, it's a whole variety of things. It's not merely growing a lot of Caledonian pines, even though they are important.
I think for a country's most outstanding places for nature conservation landscape, private ownership isn't the most appropriate. And in fact, if you look around the world, you see that that's the case. In most countries, these places are owned for the nation and run for the benefit of the people as a whole, rather than for one particular interest, such as deer stalking.
From my point of view, the issue really is redefining land ownership in terms of the balance between the freedoms and the responsibilities that go with the ownership and control of land. We have an archaic system, still technically and legally described as feudal, and it's the time for that to be reviewed.
As the argument intensifies, the ancient Caledonian forest, the natural home of the red deer, is dying. Unless the government takes urgent action, a priceless part of Britain's natural heritage will be lost forever.
These are magnificent remnants. They're beautiful places to look at. They're magnificent for wildlife. There's something very special to Scotland even. And I think we can't really begin to lecture people in the third world about what they should do about their tropical rainforests when we're making such a mess of looking after our own natural forests.